Here's a quick overview of what you need to know for the position paper due at the end of the semester. But don't just watch this video. Please look very closely at the requirements for the position paper on the essays page and at the requirements for all papers on the essay musts page. So a lot of what I would be saying in this video has already been covered in videos I made a while ago, writing an interpretive paper, parts 1 and 2. So the first part covers the thesis and structure, what you need to set up in order to make this paper effective. And the second part talks about research and evidence. So I very strongly recommend that you go ahead and watch those videos if you haven't already, and pay close attention to the ideas that I'm talking about in those two videos. The approach to writing a paper like this is also covered in a pamphlet, which used to be handed out in paper form and is now available on the website. It's called Writing a Position Paper. It's available via the resources page. I also refer to it as the Elephant Pamphlet. So I would strongly recommend taking a look at that. It goes through step by step what you need to do in order to write a position paper like this. So in this video, I'm only going to quickly summarize the things that are the key elements about what I'm looking for in the position paper assignment. This is a research paper, but it's not a research paper in which you just vomit up all of your research. You are looking to take a position and support that position, convince your reader of that position using the relevant evidence. And so this is not a situation where you need to provide all of the evidence. This is not a situation where you need to run through the entire backstory. If you're writing a paper about a particular war, you don't need to narrate the history of that war. If you're writing a paper about a particular individual, you don't need to narrate the biography of that individual. You can take that as given. What you need to do is state your argument and then provide 3 key pieces of evidence from primary and secondary sources that convince your audience that your idea is valid, that your idea is the best interpretation of the historical evidence that we have. The context for this is how historians work. Historians have this mass of evidence, or often, in my case as an ancient historian, we have little small piles of evidence. And what we have to do is, what does this evidence actually say? And it's often ambiguous, it's often fragmentary, it's often disputed, it's sometimes contradictory. The job of the historian is to say, okay, here's the evidence. What does it actually tell us about the time and place that it comes from? And so a historian's job is to formulate a thesis, to say, okay, I believe this evidence is telling us this. I believe that this evidence is telling us that such and so. Well, you have to convince the other historians. And so how do you convince an historian? You say, here's the evidence that supports my interpretation. Here's how the evidence that we have supports the interpretation that I'm giving. The key to this is a very specific thesis statement. This is why your introduction is so critical. You present your problem. A problem is something that could have more than one interpretation. So if your thesis statement is, Julius Caesar was a Roman general, well, that's not something anybody could disagree with. You need a thesis statement like, Julius Caesar was a bad Roman general. That's something that could be very passionately disputed. And so the basis for that dispute would be evidence to back it up. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to have a thesis statement that is not only taking a side that someone would disagree with, that someone, informed on the subject could argue against, as if you were picturing a debate in front of other students or other historians, and you're championing one position and someone else is championing an opposing position. You not only need to be able to envision that, but if your thesis statement is specific, then you are in a position to have a very circumscribed and narrow thing to actually prove in your paper. So your thesis statement is improved by adding onto it the specific reasons and narrowing the focus as much as possible. So you end up with a thesis that is narrow and specific and that includes the key reasons why. The sample that I provide in the elephant pamphlet:
I believe that Hannibal's use of elephants was a mistake, not because war elephants were a dumb idea in general, but because Roman adaptability meant they would inevitably find a way around them.
And this provides the path for the rest of your paper. You discuss the use of elephants in warfare having been effective because your focus is that it was a bad idea to use them against Romans. And you talk about Roman adaptability, and then you talk about how the elephants failed in their use against the Romans. You have your 3 sections laid out in your thesis. Look for a thesis statement that takes position, that is narrow enough to cover in an 8-page paper, and that includes the 3 reasons why. I believe such and so because X, Y, and Z. And then that provides the backbone of your paper, and it provides the blueprint for what you need to do next. You then need to provide the specific evidence that supports your thesis best from primary and secondary sources. And so one of the things that happens as a result of the proposal is I try to give you feedback on primary and secondary sources, but your starting point is what is available via the CUNY library system. And a great deal of this is available in terms of full text documents you can access directly from the website. So you go to the CUNY library website and you do a search, and you can select full text documents to get online resources. You want to choose to look at books, which are likely to be secondary sources, and journal articles, which you need to make sure are peer-reviewed sources. This will give you primary and secondary sources that fit in with whatever it is that you're searching for. Other things also come up in terms of your search that are not things that you want to use, that are likely to be tertiary sources. Textbooks, encyclopedias are tertiary sources. You cannot use them. Things that are listed as reference entry, that's from an encyclopedia or a similar kind of document, so that also counts as a tertiary source. A quick reminder here about kinds of sources. So primary sources are direct evidence from the time and place, eyewitness testimony from the period that you're covering. Secondary sources is scholars studying and interpreting primary sources. A primary source is, somebody giving an account of the Battle of Marathon. Secondary source is a scholar writing a book about the Battle of Marathon using the primary sources that come from that time. A tertiary source is somebody who collects up all the secondary sources and removes all of the detail and nuance and debates and gives us just the common denominator. It's the most distorted form of information, and it's ruled out for any paper in a history course. I've talked in terms of how primary sources don't give us pure information because primary sources are skewed by the bias of the person doing the reporting and problems with point of view, survival, translation. Primary sources still have to be interpreted as to what the original author is trying to convince you of. Secondary sources are one particular person's interpretation of those primary sources, which an historian like you, which you are for the purposes of this course, might or might not agree with based on the primary source evidence. Most websites are tertiary sources because they collect up all of the books and articles and pile them together and average them out to provide a consensus. That's a tertiary source. Anything that you're likely to find on the internet that's not an actual peer-reviewed academic journal is going to count as a tertiary source unless it's a transcription of primary sources. There are a number of good archive sites for primary sources, including the Perseus site at Tufts and Lacus Curtius. Primary sources that I've been able to find are collected together on the Ancient Texts page on my website. If you're looking for a particular author, say you're looking for the works of Polybius, you can check My Ancient Text website and you can find the English translation and get your sources that way. Break down your thesis into 3 sections for your paper. The 3 reasons why somebody should believe your thesis. And then find the best primary and secondary source evidence that supports each of these 3 ideas. Within each section, describe your evidence, provide citations, and once again, the second part of that writing interpretation essay and the Elephant pamphlet talks about citations. There's also a handout on the essays page. Come and talk to me if you have questions about citations. The important thing to remember here is your citations are not just for direct quotes. Anytime that you describe or paraphrase or use an idea from the sources you're working on, primary, secondary sources, anytime you're using information or ideas that come from one of those sources, there has to be a citation. There has to be a footnote or parenthetical reference that points to one of the items in your bibliography and adds a page number or section number or something that indicates where in that source you got this information. Not just direct quotes, but paraphrase, ideas, anything that comes from your sources. So you describe your evidence, and then you talk about how that evidence shows what it is that you're trying to argue. So usually you can have a paragraph to discuss what it is that the evidence is showing, and then not just a sentence that says, this shows X. Take a paragraph and talk about what the evidence is showing and how it lines up with the argument that you're making. So each of your 3 sections should begin with one of the reasons why, an assertion. You can think of this as a miniature thesis. So, for example, in the elephants example, part of your thesis was, okay, elephants aren't a bad idea inherently. So you start out your first section, elephants are sometimes effective in warfare, and you can describe evidence that shows, okay, here's how elephants were used in this war, here's how elephants were used in that war, and then a paragraph talking about how elephants were effective in these situations and why. So the key components of each section: make an assertion, describe your evidence in a paragraph, and then analyze that evidence. Talk about what it is the evidence is showing and how it lines up with your assertion in another paragraph. That's your section. And then do that for the second reason why. And then do that for the third reason why. At some point in the paper, you want to think about what it is that someone would say if they were arguing against you. You want to make sure that the whole time that person is reading your paper, they're not thinking, well, what about such and so? And if you never address that, then they're left unconvinced. And so you want to have a section that talks about the position that someone would take if they were opposing you and why that position is weak. This is a means of accomplishing the overall goal of your paper, which is to convince your audience of your opinion. And then you have a conclusion paragraph in which you talk about each of your 3 sections and then discuss how these 3 sections have demonstrated the validity of your thesis. Use evidence to convince someone of an idea. Come and see me with any questions. I will be happy to discuss your paper with each and every one of you. I will accept an optional draft up to 2 weeks before the paper is due. I will not grade the optional draft, but I will provide you with some feedback if there are sections missing or if you're on the right track or if there's something that you don't need to discuss. Other than that, just remember, you don't need to narrate the history. Just use the evidence that's available from primary and secondary sources. Use the evidence to convince your audience of what it is you believe.